The clerk will read the order of the day.
General business notice number 1, standing in the name of J. Davis, to move a motion concerning voluntary assisted dying.
I call the member for Johnston.
Madam Speaker, I move that this Assembly acknowledge the important and extensive work of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Independent Expert Advisory Panel in producing the report into voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory, recognise the right for Territorians to end their lives with dignity and the immense suffering that is caused for them and their families when this right is taken away from them, recognise that the Northern Territory, the first jurisdiction in the world to legalise voluntary assisted dying, is now the last in Australia to pass this law, urge the government to implement the 22 recommendations of the report into voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory, acknowledging that many Territorians from all political persuasions want the right to die with dignity in the Territory. Madam Speaker, I feel great honour today to move this motion. For those of you who are watching and listening and who are hoping for change, I am here on behalf of you. This motion reflects not only the values of compassion and dignity, but the clear will of so many people across the Northern Territory. From the moment I became the independent member for Johnston, community members raised the issue of voluntary assisted dying with me. In my second week in my electorate office, Maureen walked in and she said to me, "Don't you bother coming back here if you don't do something about voluntary assisted dying." That was the beginning. Since then, the calls, emails and conversations haven't stopped. People from my community and from across the Territory, from all backgrounds and all beliefs, have reached out. They've shared their grief, they've shared their hope. Some have thanked me, many have begged me to act faster, and all have asked for the same thing: the right to die with dignity, the right to choose when their end is near, how they will go. I've also met with and listened to many organisations, to health professionals, to faith leaders and to many others, and I will keep listening. And I thank my fellow MLAs across this chamber who've been willing to talk with me about this issue and explore pathways forward for the Northern Territory. This is not a theoretical debate. This is not just about politics. This is about real people, real families and real suffering. It's about Territorians who are asking us, pleading with us, to give them back a basic right, the right to die with dignity on their own terms. Madam Speaker, during our last sittings, I spoke of Gavin and of Laurie and of Sonia, long-term Territorians, each facing terminal illness. All of them said to me, "I would do anything to have this as an option." They all know legislation may not come in time for them, and still they spend what time they have left fighting for others to have the choice that they won't. Their courage and their selflessness demands something from us. It demands that we act. This motion honours their voices and the voices of so many others who have lived and died without this choice. It also acknowledges something sobering, that the Northern Territory was once a world leader in this space and it's now the last place in this country without this law. This must change. Voluntary assisted dying is not a partisan issue. It doesn't belong to one ideology. It belongs to people. It's personal. And as I said, I've heard from all corners, from doctors, from nurses, from palliative care workers, from grieving families. And yes, I've also heard from those who are uncertain. People like Sophie, who I talked about in our last sitting, a young woman from my electorate who wrote a thoughtful, courageous speech opposing voluntary assisted dying. Sophie, I read your words carefully, and I say again, good law must come from listening to all the voices, even those we may disagree with. Your concerns about protecting doctors, about protecting human rights, about investing in palliative care are valid, and they must be part of the conversation. The Voluntary Assisted Dying Independent Expert Advisory Panel have done the hard work of consultation, research and listening. Their final report is measured, thorough and humane. It gives us a clear, safe and practical path forward, one based on 22 detailed recommendations. This motion urges the government to implement those recommendations and to do so with urgency. Madam Speaker, I could spend all of my time today sharing the stories that people have sent to me. I know this is a hard and sensitive issue, but 3 people asked me specifically to share their stories with the people in this chamber. A woman from Alice Springs told me about her father who was diagnosed with a terminal neurological disease. As he lost the ability to walk, speak and eventually swallow, his only legal option was to be sedated heavily and for days while his body shut down. He told her through tears that he did not want to die this way. He wanted to go while he was still himself, while he could look her in the eye and say goodbye. That choice was denied to him and to his family. The second story is from a couple in Darwin. The wife had been battling cancer for years. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what her final weeks would look like. She didn't want her children to see her suffering. She wanted to be able to say it's time and to go surrounded by family peacefully. Her husband said to me, if she'd had that choice, she would have had peace, but instead she died with fear and pain. Finally, Gavin, who I know some of you have met and who I was lucky enough to spend a morning with recently. Gavin's lived in the Northern Territory for more than 50 years. He told me wonderful stories of riding his bike behind the bulldozer as it cleared what is now Dickward Drive. Gavin, who's been told he will have a very painful death caused by the cancer that he has, and Gavin, who will do anything to be able to end his life in the way he chooses, in the place he loves, that he's given so much to. These are not isolated stories. They're echoed across our towns and communities. People are asking for something deeply personal and profoundly simple, the right to choose how they meet their end. Madam Speaker, this is not about devaluing life. It is about valuing quality of life and recognising that when it has come to an end, that individuals should have a say in how their own journey is taken. Every other Australian except Territorians has this right. Every other state has legislated for voluntary assisted dying with strong safeguards, with strict eligibility and with compassion at the core. Those systems are working. They've been reviewed. They're safe. And we now have the opportunity and the duty to build a territory model that is just as robust and deeply responsive to our unique context, our cultures, our communities and our healthcare challenges. We know that about 85% of Territorians support this reform. They've waited decades and they should not have to wait any longer. Delaying this law any further is not neutral. It's an active choice to leave people without options and to force families through needless trauma. You've all heard me say in this chamber many times, and you'll probably have to listen to me saying it for the next 3 years, that I believe our job is to work together for the whole of the Northern Territory, to make good law with the best information we have. And here is a clear opportunity to do that. Across this chamber and with our communities, to create law that responds to the concerns, the hopes, the experiences of the people we serve. It's a chance to lead with compassion and care and to give Territorians a right that every other Australian now has, and to do it in a way that listens to and includes everyone. Madam Speaker, on behalf of the people in the community who have given me this task, I ask the CLP government to support the implementation of the 22 recommendations of the Expert Advisory Panel report. I call on this chamber to recognise the human right of all Territorians to end their life with choice and dignity. Madam Speaker, I welcome today's announcement from the Attorney-General that the CLP government will now take action on voluntary assisted dying. Initially in this chamber, the Chief Minister stated that voluntary assisted dying was not a priority for the Northern Territory, and I had many people contacting me in great distress about that. However, I'm proud to say that in response to this motion advocating for VAD in the Northern Territory, the government has now chosen to move forward and take action that reflects the overwhelming will of the people. This is a decision that will bring much needed relief to those in our community who are suffering. Today marks a significant victory for the people of the Northern Territory. It demonstrates what can be achieved when we work together in the best interest of the community. I'm grateful to the government for coming to the table and collaborating on this vital matter that will make a real difference in the lives of many. Madam Speaker, when I speak about Parliament working together to create good laws for the Northern Territory, this is exactly what I mean. And I'm particularly encouraged to see that the government seems to have taken on board the concerns that have been raised regarding the lack of consultation in the drafting of previous bills brought before this parliament. In this instance, they've outlined clear consultation requirements for the committee. This is the kind of sound, collaborative process that we should all be working for. To all the Territorians who have fought for this for so long and to those who have urged me to take action on their behalf, this is for you. For people who have contacted me worried that this will be yet another delay, I have confidence that the government is committed to taking this matter seriously and to acting on it. I know we will all be watching the work of the Legislative and Constitutional Affairs Committee closely, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes of their work by the end of September this year and to the restoration of this crucial right for the people of the Northern Territory. I commend this motion to the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Attorney General.
And Madam Speaker, I move the following amendment. Omit all words after the first dot point and insert instead, note the Attorney-General has referred the matter to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee to report back by the end of September 2025. The Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee has been provided the following terms of reference. Prepare a consolidated consultation paper drawing upon previous reports, inquiries, proposals and the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act 1995 NT. Consult extensively with communities across the Northern Territory, particularly in remote areas, to gather views on the possible introduction of voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory. Evaluate different voluntary assisted dying models and safeguards with a focus on those that would be appropriate for the Northern Territory context. Identify any specific challenges associated with delivering voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory. If the committee recommends adoption, provide drafting instructions for model legislation to give effect to voluntary assisting dying in the Northern Territory. Call on members of the Assembly to respect the deeply felt views on this issue right across the community and participate in respectful debate on this important issue. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any speakers? Member for Nightcliff.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak in support of this important motion regarding voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory. 29 years ago, our Territory led the world when we passed the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. We were the first jurisdiction anywhere to recognise that individuals facing terminal illness should have the right to choose the manner and timing of their death. That pioneering legislation demonstrated our Territory's commitment to compassion, dignity and individual autonomy. Yet today we find ourselves in the unenviable position of being the last Australian jurisdiction to implement voluntary assisted dying laws. Every state in Australia has now passed legislation allowing their citizens this fundamental right, a right that continues to be denied to Territorians. Today, in a last-minute attempt to preempt this motion, we saw the Attorney-General release a media release announcing the government will be requesting the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee to undertake an inquiry into the voluntary assisted dying report. Whilst I commend the government and budging on this issue, it is a little frustrating because the consultations were already done, and that's what the 2024 report is. However, although I am satisfied in the proposed terms of reference for this review, that they are thorough and look forward to the results. So the movement from the government on referring this to the LCAC committee is a win for the community. And I want to say this to everyone in our community. This is what having proactive, progressive crossbench can do for you. We have a Chief Minister who was bowing to the Australian Christian lobby and who was refusing to listen to the overwhelming support of the community. But we listened. We met with organisations, with families, and we pushed and you pushed, and together we have forced the government's hand. They couldn't deny your voices any longer. Of course, it remains to be seen what will come from this committee, but for a government who said this wasn't a priority for them, this is a huge step forward. Madam Speaker, the extensive work of the Voluntary Assisted Dying Independent Expert Advisory Panel deserves our highest recognition. Their comprehensive report, completed in July 2024, represents 9 months of diligent research, community consultation and careful consideration of the complex ethical, legal and practical issues. The panel received input from more than 350 individual participants through public forums and met with around 60 organisations, received 98 written submissions and gathered almost 1,400 survey responses. Importantly, 73% of survey respondents agreed that people should be able to choose when they die. The panel has provided us with 22 thoughtful recommendations that offer a clear pathway forward, one that respects both the dignity of the individual and the sanctity of life. The panel's first recommendation is that NT should implement voluntary assisted dying legislation that is broadly consistent with VAD legislation in other Australian states and territories while addressing our unique territory circumstances. I have spoken with many Territorians who have watched loved ones suffer through terminal illness without the option to end their lives with dignity. During my campaign last year, I door-knocked constituents who raised it as their biggest issue. One person in Coconut Grove took me into their home and we had a long talk about his experience with incurable cancer and his wishes to access VAD. Since becoming elected, I have spoken with many more people in my electorate for whom this issue looms large. They say, we just want the choice. I also had the privilege of meeting Sharon Cramp and her husband Spud earlier this year, and they brought with them photos and diaries of her mother, Liz Holmes, and shared with me her story. Liz, suffering breast cancer and 2 hip replacements and in unbelievable daily pain, wanted the choice to die peacefully and without pain, but this was denied to her. After a long struggle and without access to voluntary assisted dying, Liz took her own life. Sharon told me about the trauma of her mother's suffering and trauma for herself and her family having to witness their mother's pain and not be able to be with her in her final moments. Liz's story was tabled here in this Parliament in 2017 and her family feel completely let down that 8 years later there has been no movement on the issue. Sharon would like me to share the last text message that she received from her mum before she took her own life. Liz lived in New South Wales and Sharon lives here in the NT, but at the time, voluntary assisted dying was illegal in both places. Sharon wanted to be by her side, but Liz worried that her daughter would be charged if she was involved in any way. Her final text message reads, "Shaz, thanks so much for your understanding. You know I can't do this existence anymore, having nothing to look forward to but palliative care in a nursing home. I'm not doing that to you 3 or me. No euthanasia in New South Wales. Was once passed in NT. Have it happen again. You of all people can do it. Animals have it. We are animals too. It's my legacy. My spirit will always be watching over you. Love you more than words can say. Mum, XOXO." I send my deepest condolences to Sharon and her family who are listening live and thank her for her incredible bravery and persistence in advocating for voluntary assisted dying legislation here in the NT. And look, these are not isolated cases. These experiences reflect a fundamental injustice facing Territorians today. It is deeply concerning that despite widespread community support, we continue to face political resistance to these necessary reforms. The resistance from the CLP up until this point is evidence of them being unduly influenced by pressure from organisations like the Australian Christian Lobby, who made submissions against voluntary assisted dying legislation. While I respect the role of faith-based organisations in our community, their views should not determine health policy for all Territorians. The ACL's lobby efforts may align with the personal beliefs of some CLP members, but they do not reflect the views of the majority of Territorians. The panel's consultation showed overwhelming support for VAD across all demographics and regions, with 73% of respondents supporting the right to choose, and in other polls nationwide as high as 80% or 85%, it is clear that this legislation transcends partisan politics. I ask my colleagues across the aisle, will you represent the wishes of your constituents or allow external lobby groups to dictate the position? Let me be clear, this is not a partisan issue. Support for voluntary assisted dying legislation cuts across political divides. The desire for dignity at the end of life is not aligned with any particular ideology. Polling consistently shows that a significant majority of Territorians, like most Australians, support this reform. Critics may argue that palliative care should be sufficient. The panel's recommendation 7 specifically addresses this, recognising the importance of palliative care services in the NT and recommending that a person who requests VAD must be informed of all treatment options, including palliative care. Critically, it also recommends that palliative care services must be consistently and adequately resourced. Madam Speaker, the panel, now that we've got the amendment, some of it's not as relevant. It is time to restore the rights that Territorians briefly held nearly 3 decades ago. It is time to end the situation where dying Territorians must either continue to suffer or leave their homes, communities and support networks to access rights available to other Australians. The Northern Territory has always prided itself on its independent spirit and practical approach to difficult issues. We were leaders once in this area. We should be leaders again, not reluctant followers. Despite the announcement of the review to be carried out by the LCAC, I still urge all members of the Assembly to support this motion and work together in spirit of cooperation to implement these recommendations with the urgency they deserve. This is not about politics, this is about compassion. This is about dignity. This is about the fundamental right of Territorians to make their own choices at the end of their lives. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Are there any other speakers? Opposition Leader.
Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for Johnston for bringing on this very important motion to the House today. Madam Speaker, every individual deserves dignity, compassion and the right to make informed decisions about the support and medical care they receive as they near end of life. Palliative care can help people with terminal or life-limiting illnesses to live free of pain and discomfort as much as possible in order to ensure that that person and their families are receiving the support that they need. Whether that's physical, mental, emotional, practical or spiritual support, Madam Speaker. These are very personal decisions and will be different for every single person, depending on their circumstances, their beliefs, their values, their family considerations, and many other factors. What is important in these circumstances, Madam Speaker, is choice. Every Territorian should have the right to choose for themselves what end-of-life care should look like for them should they choose to follow that. Madam Speaker, for some people with terminal illness, disease or medical condition, this may include choosing the time and place for ending their life with the assistance of a medical professional. Madam Speaker, once upon a time, the Northern Territory was a pioneer when it came to voluntary assisted dying. In 1995, the Northern Territory became the first jurisdiction in the world to legally give people this option through the Rights of the Terminally Ill Act. It was the proud political legacy of the then CLP Chief Minister, Marshall Perrin, who believed very strongly in the rights of Territorians to voluntarily end their life. Mr Perrin continues to this day, Madam Speaker, to advocate for assisted dying rights in the Northern Territory, and I acknowledge his continued advocacy and care for the Northern Territory. Mr Perrin was a politician of principles who strongly believed in giving Territorians this final crucial control over their lives. Mr Perrin showed and continues to show true leadership on this issue, Madam Speaker, which is much more that can be said for the current CLP government, who has desperately tried to avoid this issue right up until today, when they were forced to act and send out the rushed media release this morning, ahead of the 3 o'clock general business day today in the Parliament. Madam Speaker, not everyone in our community supports voluntary assisted dying, and their beliefs and opinions on this highly personal and highly sensitive matter deserve to be respected. However, it is also true that there is strong support across the Northern Territory and our communities for voluntary assisted dying. Madam Speaker, after the federal government intervened and overturned the Northern Territory's Rights of the Terminally Ill Act in 1997, we have seen other jurisdictions consult on and introduce their own voluntary assisted dying legislation in support of terminally ill people in their jurisdictions who are ready and able to make a choice about ending their lives if they choose to do so. I know in my team, Madam Speaker, the member for Arafura has his own personal story of a family friend interstate who chose to end their life peacefully and surrounded by their loved ones. It took until 2022 for the Australian Parliament, Madam Speaker, to pass the Restoring Territory Rights Bill, allowing the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory the right to legislate on voluntary assisted dying once again. Madam Speaker, this bill was largely thanks to the strong advocacy of re-elected member for Solomon, Luke Gosling, OAM. At the time, Mr Gosling had this to say about the bill, and I quote, "This bill does not legislate voluntary assisted dying. It is about democratic equality and fairness. For too long, Australians living in the territories have been treated as second-class citizens when it comes to legislating on matters that impact on their own lives. It's well past time for that to end. It is called the Restoring Territory Rights Bill because it is all it seeks to do, to level the democratic playing field and restore legislative rights to the territories." End quote. Madam Speaker, the member for Solomon's advocacy and hard work, alongside his ACT counterpart, the also newly re-elected federal member for Canberra, Alicia Payne, paved the way for the former Labor government to recommence a conversation with the Northern Territory community about voluntary assisted dying. At the time, Madam Speaker, former Labor government recognised this was a very complex issue for many people across our community and for many different reasons. We knew that there were many sensitive matters to consider before reintroducing any legislation that would give Territorians their right back for that very important choice. In late 2023, the then Northern Territory Labor government established an independent expert advisory panel on VAD to have the conversation with the community, working through this issue very carefully. This panel was led by the Honourable Vicky O'Halloran, AO, CVO, and Duncan McConnell, SC, who undertook this extensive consultation across the Territory. Madam Speaker, the committee heard from 350 individual participants through public forums and other meetings. They met with 60 organisations. They received 98 written submissions and almost 1,400 survey responses. The committee opened up discussions on what voluntary assisted dying was and on who should have access to it, on how people should have access to it, on models of care, on the role of health professionals, on how it should be monitored, on what safeguards should be put in place. It was a thoughtful, well-informed and considered conversation across the breadth of the Territory, engaging with many people from many walks of life between August 2023 and April 2024. Madam Speaker, the panel also spoke with individuals and organisations in other jurisdictions across the country to understand what their voluntary assisted dying experiences were, as well as taking in the already extensive research available that has been done in this very issue when it comes to voluntary assisted dying legislation in Australia and around the world. A report was delivered to the government in July 2024 here in the Northern Territory, Madam Speaker, not long before the Territory election, with 2022 comprehensive recommendations for introducing a safe and practical framework for VAD. It is disappointing now, Madam Speaker, that the CLP, under pressure, in their reactive mode as usual, looked like they now have to kick the can down the road because they do not want to show or allow their members to have their conscience vote on the issue when it comes to VAD, and have suggested consultation when we know already this has occurred in the Territory. Madam Speaker, the CLP government has failed to consult on domestic violence. The CLP government has failed to consult on changes to the sacred side legislation. They have failed to consult properly on scrapping the portable long service leave, and they have failed to consult on the moving of the location for the Northern Suburbs Youth Hub. The list goes on. And now, Madam Speaker, the CLP have decided that they want to do really extensive consultation on VAD, knowing all the more well as I do, Madam Speaker, this work has already taken place in the Territory. And it is beyond pathetic for such an important issue for Northern Territorians that this would be kicked down the road by the government, who says that their 2025 year is of action, certainty and security. Madam Speaker, while timing constraints prevented legislation from being introduced before the Territory election of 2024, our Labor team committed to reviewing these recommendations thoroughly and introducing VAD legislation for a conscience vote if re-elected to government. And that remains our position. It is deeply disappointing, Madam Speaker, that the Chief Minister, Leah Finocchiaro, who at one stage was going to introduce her own General Business Day motion around voluntary assisted dying, and her team now, the CLP team, Madam Speaker, have failed to show any leadership on this very issue. The ongoing advocacy and engagement from organisations such as the Council of the Ageing NT, or COTA, many people would know, Go Gentle Australia, the Northern Territory Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and many other community groups has been essential in continuing to keep this issue on the public agenda. Their voices and their advocacy are crucial in the ongoing conversation because we know the government is silent on this issue. Madam Speaker, I was deeply moved by the story of Laurie Martin, who wrote to myself and other members of this chamber in support of voluntary assisted dying. Miss Martin shared her story of being diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease at the age of just 54. And I'll quote some of Laurie's story. "In time, I will be bedridden. Eating and talking will become more difficult, if not near impossible. Current friendships will fade and I'll be left, along with nursing staff. This is my reality. I stay and linger, struggling for every breath. But I am not near the end yet. It gets much worse. This isn't about death, it's about choice, about dignity, about hope." End quote. Madam Speaker, I sincerely thank Miss Martin for having the bravery to share her story. Madam Speaker, the Chief Minister has said legislation to reintroduce voluntary assisted dying here in the Northern Territory is not a priority for the CLP government. They have been forced this morning to put out their rushed and reactive media release in the preemption of this debate this afternoon. The CLP want to do this so-called extensive consultation, something they've never really done before in the last 9 months, to keep kicking the can down the road on this issue. Madam Speaker, governments need to be able to govern for all people, and they need to be able to manage across a broad range of issues in the best interests of their constituents and to address complex matters across the Territory and show leadership in these matters. Mr. Deputy Speaker, saying something isn't a priority is an excuse. It's an excuse not to act. It's an excuse for no action. It's an excuse for no certainty. It's an excuse for no security when it comes to the leadership on voluntary assisted dying in the Territory. When a politician says something isn't a priority, you need to dig a bit deeper and find the real reason that they aren't willing to provide action, which is what they promised they'll do this year for Territorians. And particularly when all the hard work and the hard conversations have already been had and the work has already been done, it beggars belief that the CLP still is running from a complex and sensitive matter. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in this case, I would argue the real reason is lack of courage and lack of leadership. There are many people across all of the communities that we represent who have strongly held views against allowing voluntary assisted dying. And that is absolutely fine. It is their prerogative, and I absolutely respect that. Some of these people are my Arnhem constituents. Some of them live in the electorates of my Labor colleagues. And some people hold these views on faith-based grounds, some on cultural grounds, some on both. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are all very well aware of this, as is the Chief Minister. But I truly believe that sometimes you have to make decisions that are in the interests of or which align with the views of the majority of Territorians, whether you are personally supportive or not, whether you fear pushback from people who you represent or not, or if you're worried about those who support you questioning what you have done. Mr. Deputy Speaker, sometimes you just have to do what the community wants, and we saw that recently with the urgent sittings of Parliament, even when it is a hard thing to do, even when it may go against your initial belief and your gut feeling. On this matter, Mr. Deputy Speaker, voluntary assisted dying is not something that everyone in our community supports. But as we know so far, almost 80% of Territorians do support it, do support the choice that Territorians should be able to make, just like the rest of the country is able to make. This is a significant number of Territorians who say they want the choice for either themselves or their loved ones when the time is right, should unfortunately it ever occur to them or their loved ones. And that choice is not for me to decide. That choice is not for anyone else in this chamber to decide or to personally judge. But what is not possible right now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is it's not even a choice available for Territorians. And that is the real inequality and injustice in this, that Territorians do not have the same rights and choice as the fellow Australians do when it comes to VAD. When it comes to ending someone's own suffering on their own terms, to be able to make a personal decision that has dignity and compassion at the very heart of why they are making a decision. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I believe it is incumbent on us here in this Northern Territory Legislative Assembly chamber to respect that wish and to bring back this legislation for consideration and debate and allow Territorians a choice. And ultimately, for every member to vote on this important issue based on their own beliefs through a conscience vote. This is the right thing to do. This is a priority for many Territorians that we represent, and the Chief Minister and her CLP government have the chance to do the right thing when it comes to allowing Territorians their choice, rather than to play the safe game and for political convenience. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I strongly urge the Chief Minister and the CLP government to listen to the many voices of Territorians and commit to bringing this legislation before the House. And in noting, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the Attorney-General has moved the amendment to the motion, I recognise elements of the amended motion, but I do support, on behalf of the Labor opposition, the original context from the member for Johnston in allowing, and thank the member for Johnston for bringing this important issue and matter to the House, because again, we do not want important issues or complex issues to fall off the table. We do not want to put aside an issue that may challenge us, whether it's here in this chamber, whether it's out in our electorates, or whether it's visiting other parts of the Northern Territory and doing our best job to represent all views of Northern Territorians. And despite any personal views at this point, again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the large and loud, overwhelming evidence and advocacy is around making sure Territorians have the same right of choice as the rest of Australia. We do not deserve to be second-class citizens when it comes to Northern Territory and our own legislation. We do not deserve to be cut out from a conversation that the rest of the country has already steamed ahead with. And certainly, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we do not deserve to be the last jurisdiction to allow this choice when we were the very first jurisdiction in the globe, in the whole world, to allow for this. We should honour a legacy that puts people first And I believe, regardless of politics and regardless of personal view, having that choice is absolutely the right thing to do. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. Leader of the Opposition, Member for Araloon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm speaking today because I think I'm the only person in this chamber who has come out publicly and stated that I don't particularly agree with voluntary assisted dying. I'm not enamoured by it. I have grave concerns about it. But I do accept that all Australians, apart from Territorians, now have a right to voluntary assisted dying. So it is a fait accompli, I think, that Territorians will have the right to voluntary assisted dying at some point in the future. So I accept that, and I take on board what the opposition leader has just spoken about, the fact that Territorians deserve a choice. But I do have concerns, and I think that the amendment that the Attorney-General has proposed to do some more consultation, some more grassroots consultation, is probably a good idea, although both Labor, the former Labor government, and the current CLP government could be accused of procrastinating on this issue, because I think most of us, if we delve deeply, know where we stand and probably know how we're going to vote. But I think to do some more consultation, a new government, a new round of consultation is probably a good thing. I know that the process that the former Labor government used in their consultation process was criticised by the Australian Christian lobby. I know that the member for Nightcliff has expressed her concerns about this particular group, but they felt that their participation, particularly in the Alice Springs consultation process that was back in the 16th of November 2023, that the process started on the premise that this will happen, and the consultation was about how it will happen. They felt that that was premature. They didn't like that premise. They felt that it was a bad place to start because, of course, a lot of Christian people have a problem with voluntary assisted dying, so they participated in those consultation processes across the Northern Territory, wanting to state publicly and through that process why they didn't support voluntary assisted dying. So they came away quite disappointed when they were told, well, no, that's not our starting point. Our starting point is how, not if. So I think if this new consultation process that the CLP have triggered tonight starts on the premise of what do you think, is it a good thing or a bad thing, not it's going to happen and how do you want it to happen. People, all Territorians need to have a voice in this, and they will have a voice, hopefully through us when we finally get to vote on it through this chamber. But I think we need to go back a step. I think it's interesting that for me, living in Alice Springs, and I'm not sure what the member for Guyula intends to talk about, but a lot of my constituents are Aboriginal people that have fear around voluntary assisted dying. They don't necessarily like it, they don't necessarily understand it, and they have certain fears that will take a lot more than a consultation process and a bill going through Parliament to allay their fears. And I think that's something that we have to, it's something unique to the Northern Territory, and it's something that we can't ignore. The fact that 30% of our population are Aboriginal people. I'm not saying that most of them or even all of them have these fears, but I know, I've heard from constituents of mine, Aboriginal people, that they don't like the idea of VAD, they don't trust it, and they don't want it. So, I'm not equipped in any way to represent those people's views, but I know that they exist. I find it interesting that the member for Nightcliff and the member for Johnston, who normally speak up and empower the voice of Aboriginal people, haven't mentioned that, because that's one of the things I consider when I'm thinking about VAD. How will this impact on a very significant proportion of our population who are often disempowered through processes of government and often neglected? So their voices have to be heard. Those voices are very important, as are all Territorians. I wanted to also say that along the lines of the member for Nightcliff, but all voices are important, and there are spiritual concerns around how this practice of voluntary assisted dying is implemented. How do people's spiritual beliefs and needs, how are they respected and heard through this process, as well as the cultural needs that I just referred to? I think that in the Northern Territory there are so many things that we do very well, but there are also things that we don't do well at all. And the one that smacks us all in the face, particularly over the last 24 hours, is LCAC. And you're probably thinking, what's LCAC got to do with VAD? But I think the way that we set up LCAC was not tailored well to the needs and the nature and the peculiarities of the Northern Territory. And we've seen a complete failure of LCAC because of that. And I think that setting up a model of providing voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory will hit the same roadblocks, the same problems, or very, very similar. We are such a small jurisdiction, we are such a small population, as we know, spread out over a vast geographical area. How on earth are we going to educate people about VAD and provide a compassionate and sensitive and highly professional service across the length and breadth of the Northern Territory? It is going to be a logistical nightmare, as is the provision of a lot of services. I mean, randomly today I received a letter from someone concerned about a movement service, a movement nurse that was servicing the whole of the Northern Territory or beyond Darwin, that's being cut back because there's no funding. I mean, you know, there's services, health services throughout the Northern in the Northern Territory that you can only access in very particular places. They're not accessible throughout the Northern Territory. We know that. When we debated years ago the use of medical terminations, you know, the conversation went to how do we make that accessible to all Territorians. So I think VAD will be one of those things that we have to come up with a very, very unique and different model in how we provide it, that's equitable and sensible and affordable. We've just had the budget in the last 24 hours. The provision of VAD in the Northern Territory could cost millions and millions of dollars every year, because of course we know through the recommendations of the report that was produced back last year in 2024, that it has to be of a very, very high standard. It has to be bulletproof. You have to have layers of accountability. How on earth can we get away with not setting up a full structure and it costing many millions of dollars? So going back to LCAC, my view right from before we set up LCAC was that we should have outsourced a lot of it. And once again, I go back to that model. I think that we've got to do something bold and different when it comes to VAD. I think we need to think about an outsource model. I know Queensland do it. I'm not by no means an expert on how they do it over there, but I understand they've got zones, they've got specialist teams that cover different geographical zones within Queensland. They do outreach, of course, they've got a vast geographical area too. So I think that we should be considering using the existing services within other jurisdictions to provide their expertise to us just over the border, whether it's WA or South Australia or Queensland, that they should, as an option or a possibility, that they come to us rather than us set up a whole system. That's the mistake we made with ICAC, I think, that we should have outsourced the investigations instead of trying to set it up and struggle to find the right people to work in our ICAC services. We should have outsourced ICAC, and I think we should look at a similar sort of model for VAD. It's very difficult to get specialists to the Northern Territory. We all know that, specialists in any field. So it's going to be very, very difficult to set up voluntary assisted dying in the Northern Territory. And to begin with, the numbers could be incredibly low. I mean, I've been given this pretty interesting book, and I think everyone's received it, Go Gentle Australia, State of the VAD, and it's a report on voluntary assisted dying across throughout Australia, but also New Zealand. And the figures are quite interesting. I mean, since 2019, they're saying that 7,208 terminally ill people have sought access to VAD. Of those, less than half of them have died using a VAD substance. And that's, millions of people. I actually don't have a number of what the population of all of Australia plus New Zealand is. But I think when we talk about the Northern Territory, to start off with, the numbers could be incredibly small. It could be less than 10 a year. That's the sort of numbers that I've heard. For the first couple of years, you could be talking about 5 or 6 or 10 or 20, unlikely any more than those sorts of numbers. So I guess, if we're going to go down this path, and we are, it's a fait accompli, I think. I'd be very surprised if ultimately, if we put up our hands tonight and voted for or against VAD, that it would be voted down. We have to be sensible about this. We have to look very creatively and sensibly at a model that will work, and it will work forever and be something we can be proud of, because I think we have too many examples of things not going well, not being sustained, being hideously expensive, and not necessarily delivering the high quality of service that all Territorians deserve and require. So I have issues, I have ideas, and I will be participating in this consultation process the Attorney General has put forward to the Chamber tonight. I think that it gives us another round of opportunity to have some input, all Territorians. I think we need to tread very carefully, and I think we must get this model right. We must make sure that it is fit for purpose for the unique environment and circumstances of the Northern Territory. And I think that we need not only to look circumspectly into the Northern Territory, but we need to look beyond. I think that's probably a part of the motion that's been put forward that is a little bit lacking. I think added to that, we probably need to almost do an international look at what's happening across the world. There are all different sorts of models, and some countries are absolutely well advanced. They've been practising voluntary assisted dying or euthanasia for many, many years. But I will leave you with a thought, and I shared this recently, this story recently with with a colleague. I was in Coles in Alice Springs just before Christmas, and this amazing elderly German woman who I know quite well, she bound me up in the supermarket, and she's very modern and contemporary and well-read and educated, and she said, "This voluntary assisted dying, Robyn," and I thought, ooh, she read that I don't necessarily support it. And she said, you know, in Germany, we don't have voluntary assisted dying. We don't have voluntary assisted dying because people are very fearful of VAD, given the history of war and the Nazi mass murders, which they called euthanasia. We don't have assisted suicide in Germany. There's factions that want it and factions that regularly lobby for it, but we don't have it because people are fearful. People do not trust the regime or the government of Germany to implement it safely and fairly and sensitively. And then she went on to say that she'd worked in another European country where they had VAD. She worked in an aged care facility, and she said, Robyn, families would routinely come into that aged care facility demanding that voluntary assisted dying was used on their elderly relative because they were greedy, they wanted access to the estate of the elderly person. And this woman said to me, Robyn, she said, I'm not saying that that's going to happen routinely in the Northern Territory, but she said, you are right to be cautious and careful because things can go wrong and it can be misused, and if it's not understood properly and executed properly, it can divide and be a major problem. So on that note, I guess I would like to leave the chamber with my final thought that I am still very concerned about this, but I will by no means be preventing Northern Territorians from having access to the same rights as other Australians. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Bodger.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I do want to take the opportunity to speak on this tonight, and this has been a conversation that I've had for some time with the member for Araluen around the importance and the sensitivities and the characteristics that need to be identified and discussed. And I want to start by putting on the record that I am a proud Territorian, that I am a Catholic who has been baptised, communed and confirmed. I am a Catholic person who is incredibly proud of our new Pope, Pope Leo XIV. But I also am absolutely proud to ensure that every Territorian gets to have a say over their future and their lives. And the motion that's been brought forward by the member for Johnston is incredibly important, and I want to make it really clear. What we're being asked on today is not to have that vote, is not to say yes or no about voluntary assisted dying itself, but is to actually say, as a parliament, let's get on with the job of bringing an actual piece of legislation to the Legislative Assembly for this Assembly to go out and talk on. Now, what the Attorney-General has done is she's seen that the member for Johnston had rearranged the notice paper yesterday, as she is entitled to do, and they've then used this as a political opportunity to go out this morning and make a statement about something that the member for Johnston was already coming in here to do. There has been extensive consultation. There was consultation done in 2015. There was consultation done extensively by the Independent Committee in 2023, which was absolutely delivered by, of course, the esteemed Duncan McConnell and the Honourable Vicky O'Halloran, absolutely travelling out and talking to people about what are some of the considerations that need to be adhered to when making a report to the government that need to be embedded. So I acknowledge that an amendment has been circulated around to all honourable members, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that motion certainly talks about referring it to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, but I'm not exactly sure if it's been highlighted what they are consulting on. We're consulting on a consulted report. We're consulting on expert advice that's been provided to government. What I would be supportive of is the position that the member for Johnston has put in, asking the government to go away, do the work on a draft. Then we've actually got a draft exposure bill to go out and talk to community on, to talk to them about this is what is being proposed. Because at the moment, there is nothing. At the moment, it will continue to be a question around whether or not this should happen. We actually should be working to bring in a draft bill before the Parliament, allow all 25 members to go back to their communities, to talk to their communities and to say, is this what you want or not? And then actually have a vote on Parliament. And if it passes, then we can go and do the work to make sure that the implementation can be done. We can set a date into the future that it becomes an active piece of legislation. Or if this Assembly voted no, then we have an answer. Because I want to also acknowledge the amazing advocacy of people in our community. And I want to really highlight one individual in particular, and that's Judy Dench from the Northern Territory. When I first entered Parliament in 2016, she was one of the first people to reach out and to really encourage us to push the Commonwealth Government for the return of territory rights. And she spoke about her story. She spoke about the care and the empathy and the love of her husband, but also the trauma and the sadness that he felt and that she felt that he was exposed to. Now, fast forward, 2022, the Federal Parliament considers this. Territory Parliament has had a long history when it comes to trying to restore those territory rights. I want to acknowledge a few people who are no longer members of either the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly or the Australian Parliament. And I want to acknowledge the hard work and advocacy of Chansey Paech, the former member for Guyula, who always stood up for territory rights. It wasn't whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, VAD, it was about returning the decision-making back to the territory to make and shape laws for themselves. And I want to also acknowledge the former country Liberal Senator turned independent, Sam McMahon, Dr Sam McMahon, who was also firm in the return of territory rights. Now fast forward to 2022, and I want to acknowledge the 3 out of the 4 territory representatives in the Federal Parliament who voted for the return of territory rights. Senator Mullenderi McCarthy. I want to also acknowledge Marion Scrimgeour. I want to acknowledge Luke Gosling, and it would also be remiss of me not to acknowledge the former member for Yingiya, Warren Snowden, in the hard work and advocacy they've all done to get territory rights restored and actually enable us now to have this conversation and to actually allow these decisions to be made in the Northern Territory, because that is incredibly important. Again, I acknowledge the concerns, and I want to absolutely say from the onset, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think we absolutely need to have a commitment from the government that after it's finished at the Legislative Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, that it doesn't just sit there for eternity. Because the way that the motion is being drafted and reads, it does not say that it would then make a definitive decision on what will happen with voluntary assisted dying. It doesn't say that a draft piece of legislation would be created. It doesn't say that no further action or action is required. It basically lays out here that it would look at recommendations and adoptions and measures, but it doesn't give us a definitive date. It continues to leave the Territorians in limbo, Mr Deputy Speaker. What we do need is that commitment. And if we're all talking about consultation and the need to do it, we need a draft bill based on the extensive expert advice that committee, that panel did to help shape something. And everyone in this parliament, we all know how it works. Use that advice, use that evidence, use those experiences, use those stories that have been collected to then work on providing something that we can go out and consult with. We can bring a draft exposure bill out to talk to people and say, this is what the parliament is potentially considering. Where are there changes that are needed? What is not good? Or if you don't support it, that's okay, but we need to understand, because that's important. This is obviously a conscience vote for members in the parliament, and I haven't made up my mind how I'll vote, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I too, when there is a draft bill, will go out and talk with my community, we'll talk with them, and we'll hear their concerns, and we'll hear the suggestions that they may have around this. But right now, we're not even getting anywhere near to a position to be able to allow those conversations to happen, because we're referring something to a committee where there's already been extensive work done. We need not hide behind committee processes. Let's draft a bill. Let's put that draft exposure out to the community to have an active conversation, to actively engage on, and then we can work to that. I've spoken with the member for Araluen at length about this during catch-up with a coffee, and my biggest fear about VAD is that it will be politically hijacked and motivated by people who will scaremonger and provide fear and hate and division in our community. That is something that we all must work to ensure doesn't happen, that the conversations and the dialogues absolutely need to be civil, be respectful, and be calm. And I'm certainly not going to judge people on their position, because I absolutely acknowledge that this is an issue that many people talk about and many people have differing views and opinions on. When you hear stories from around the country of people using it, you hear those stories, you hear the very sadness of people who have lost someone, but you also hear the stories of people who get to see their loved ones' final wishes being respected and upheld. And that's incredibly, incredibly important, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to just highlight as well, I have done a fair amount of homework interstate around voluntary assisted dying, and it's not a matter of rocking up to a doctor and saying, hey, I want to die tomorrow. There is a very long consultative process that involves psychological and psychiatric assessments, counselling, multiple visits to a doctor, expert medical advice on the prognosis and the level of pain and of the condition that you are in. And during that consultation process that was happening in the Northern Territory, there was a conversation around where and how it could be administered, because there is a question around telehealth, and that is an issue that remains ongoing with the Commonwealth of Australia in terms of the laws on a Commonwealth level. But that's all been included in the consultation, where and how it could be recommended to be used. So it is absolutely incredibly important. I think that we all should remain very respectful of each other's views and opinions and faiths and beliefs, because they do differ, and that's okay. But I absolutely, for the purposes of seeing this move, even if it is a small step forward, I absolutely will accept and support the amendment brought forward by the government to send this to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, because that's at least a step forward. But we all need to be very clear that we owe it to Territorians to not leave this in the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. After September, when a report is brought back, we need to be very, very clear on what the next steps are. And that should be a draft exposure bill. That's not saying that the government supports it or doesn't support it, but the government is in power and they will be the ones who will have to ask the Parliamentary Council to draft a bill. And I want to make it really clear that if that is the case, I'm not going to go out and tell everyone this is what the government's doing. We all need to be really clear in saying the government, after this committee, has instructed a report to be done, and now draft exposure is being done. This is a conscience vote for the Northern Territory Legislative Assembly, how it will be done. And if members are uncomfortable in here about voting or how it looks, then let's actually have a conversation as a parliament around how that vote would take place to make you all feel empowered about the decision that you are going to have to make at some point. Because if the government don't do it, then there will come a time where a bill will be presented to Parliament by someone else. So it is important. I do sincerely thank the member for Johnston for bringing this forward. I do want to thank the countless amazing advocates across the Northern Territory, Judy Dench, the members at CODA, all of these amazing people who have done really strong work and advocacy, incredibly important. And yes, there are groups who have differing views and opinions, but we can get to a very respectful position. But I absolutely stand by, we need to have a draft piece of legislation done that we can go out to our communities and say, this is what is being proposed, this is what is being spoken about. But Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk on this. I supported the amendment that's been brought forward by the government, but I want to make it really absolutely clear. First and foremost, I support the motion brought forward by the member for Johnston. It's incredibly important. And I will say to the Attorney-General, this is being referred to the Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee. I am a proud black fella. I might look white, but I am proud of my culture, I'm proud of my language, and I'm proud of my law. And any consultation done in the Northern Territory needs a significant portion of allocated funds to interpreter services to absolutely make sure that people are aware of what's being spoken about, what's being agreed to or not agreed to, and we need to empower and employ local people on the ground in communities to do that work, because that's incredibly important. We need to make sure that things are done and in print as well, because that's incredibly important. We've done it before with the Burial and Cremation Act in the Northern Territory. We had interpreters, we created visual, audio-visual installations, movies, those types of things, so that we could be absolutely guaranteed that it was going to be done and that consultation was absolutely done in a respectful and a clear manner. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is also I think important to leave here that we're referring this off for further consultation. It's then going to have to go on the notice paper for 28 days if there is a draft bill. We'll give people time again to talk about just how important this is. But Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. Thank you, Member for Johnston, for the opportunity to talk about this, and I want to congratulate you on proceeding to get this to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Gwadja. Member for Mulca.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I stand to speak on this motion today. Voluntary assisted dying is not a simple issue for Yolngu people. We have beliefs on death and do not include assisted dying. When someone elderly or with a terminal illness, disease is dying, this is a time when we engage in ceremony. We are singing the songlines that provides a comfort and allow the person's spirit to go home to the ancestors. But it's also possible that the ancestors will bring healing, and it may not be the person's time to die, and they come back to us. This ceremony is important for the family to allow for healing of that person, or if the time is right, sending their loved one home in the right way. Beliefs in our culture mean that voluntary assisted dying could create a fear and blame brought out of our communities. If someone dies early, there could be a blame placed on the family, and this has happened. There is also a fear of the health system generally. When family members have been sent to hospital for care and never returned, our communities feel worry is what was happening and what happened, and whether they die naturally and that they have died without ceremony. These issues are in our community create fear and about VAD. I acknowledge that many people in Balanda communities also do not support VAD, but there are many people who do support this option at the end of their life. I do not wish to say what is right or wrong for another culture and cultural group, but I do believe that any committee that looks at this issue and the development of a bill for the Northern Territory must be very, very careful and thoughtful about understanding the cross-cultural perspectives on this issue. VAD is not something that will be helpful in our Yolngu communities. It will create fear and mistrust. Any bill that is developed in the NT must be sophisticated enough to allow cultural groups to opt out. There must be a very clear cultural protections with no blurry lines. It is clear from the VAD report that it was very difficult to consult broadly with Aboriginal communities. The report says there was a notable silence or hesitation from some communities, and there is a need for a continuation discussion with Aboriginal communities. It is clear that as the last jurisdiction in Australia, the Northern Territory will move towards towards some kind of bill on VAD, but Northern Territory is a very different place to the rest of the Australia, and these differences must be reflected in our laws. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll say that again, sorry. Madam Speaker, this is a very sacred part of Aboriginal custom. When we die, our bodies become a sacred object. Our ancestors will appear when we are getting ready to die, and we know that they are taking us home. These are the important parts of preparing and for death, and our traditions and customs are critical at this time. So it is important that in the discussion of VAD by the LCAC committee seeks advice from cultural leaders, not just an invitation for submissions, but the committee should identify Aboriginal elders who hold authority for their people and ask them about any changes to the laws. And it is the VAD panel found there is silence coming from Aboriginal communities and leaders on this issue. This silence may be telling you that the fear attached to VAD is so great that people do not want to engage. This should be considered and understood as part of consultation process. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Are there any other speakers? The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The question is that the original motion, that the motion as amended be agreed to, sorry. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.